Okay, there's three of us. 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you all for joining me on this speech that I'm going to do about aerodynamics. My name is Nathan Lesniewski, and the history of aerodynamics and how it affects us in our everyday lives. When I was a kid, I was somewhat fascinated by aerodynamics and even making paper airplanes. Now, starting with a simple paper airplane, we would make these, and you would learn about different shapes and how they behaved. And even back then, I was putting winglets on the end, which if you've been on a plane these days, you've actually seen winglets on those planes, which they could have asked me about that as a 10-year-old, and I would have told them that that's just better for flight. So also, I really enjoyed riding my bike around neighborhoods. And as an elementary school individual that rode my bike to schools and rode around neighborhoods, one of the things that I learned was that if I got lower on the bicycle, I went faster down the hill. Now, I didn't know what I was doing at the time. I just knew the air sounded different, the wheels sounded different, the way they were turning, and the tires made different noises, and I went faster. How did I learn that? Maybe I saw someone else do it. Maybe it's just something that you did, and you kind of thought, well, wait a second. If I try to get this air to behave differently, then I'm going to be able to move faster. And that was basically me lowering my CDA, my coefficient of drag number, which you're just making your frontal area smaller, which is important for things that we're going to talk about later in this speech. So the history of aerodynamics started a long time ago with something as simple as sailboats. Now, if anybody has seen a sailboat or understood how people cross the oceans, centuries ago, they were using aerodynamics, and they knew how to use the wind, and they understood this wind is pushing. How can I harness this energy? So nowadays, we focus a lot on trying to avoid aerodynamic drag, and for many reasons. So part of the history of aerodynamics is going to go back into the 1920s and 1930s. In the 1920s and 1930s, NASA created what's called NACA, which is the National Association Committee of Aerodynamics, which sounds like a very engineering way of saying something like that. What they did was they took all these different foil shapes, wing foil shapes, as you can see right here. These shapes they studied, and they were using fluid dynamics because wind tunnels didn't really exist at the time. They would put something in a water, and then they would drop in a dye or something like that, and they would move the water and see what these shapes did. They came up with 78 unique shapes, and to this day, a lot of these shapes are still used, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. Sometimes it's speed, sometimes it's lift, sometimes you're carrying a lot of weight. So engineers still use these designs to begin the process of figuring out what shape do we need to accomplish this particular task. Next time you get on a Boeing 737, if you want to really make your passenger bored, you can say, that wing, that's a NACA 0012 shape. Now they're either going to put on headphones and ignore you, or they're going to ask you, what are you talking about? A Cessna, for example, is a very different purpose, and that's a NACA 1144 shape, which is for a more lightweight load. Now, a lot of this piqued my curiosity into aerodynamics, and there's a person that lives in Tyler, Texas, who is famous for being the aerodynamicist for Lance Armstrong and other triathletes and cyclists. And I would always ask him questions when I would see him. Well, what do you think about this shape? What do you think about this shape? What about this? What about this? And he finally got probably a little annoyed with me and said, well, I'll tell you what. Why don't you come down to the wind tunnel with me at Texas A&M? And you're good with data, right? Yes, sir. I'm good with data. He goes, okay. Well, we're going to go down. We're going to do all these tests, and then you're going to present the data to these athletes, after the tests are over and doing graphs and explaining what the different tests were for. Now, the A&M wind tunnel is a low-speed wind tunnel, and that's because it's not supersonic, as in it only goes up to about 240 miles per hour. However, it's regarded as one of the most accurate wind tunnels that is in the U.S. NASA uses it, for example, to test models. The Navy uses it to test models of ships. The Air Force uses it to test models, and they have a room in the basement where they have all these models that they've kept. And NASA has a standing agreement where they can just walk in the door at any moment and say, we have a thing, we need to go start testing this parachute because something with the space shuttle is going on. And so it's very accurate. The balance, which is what the bicycles and cars, etc., will sit on top of, is so sensitive. You could put a quarter on it and it can tell you that there's a quarter on it. It's 2 stories tall, and I've been down there and looked at it. It's really hard to comprehend, and it turns whenever you're running tests. So what you're trying to do is create different angles of the wind approaching you. It's called yaw, dead on, 0, 5, 10, 15, 20, etc. We've all experienced crosswinds in cars. You've felt it, the buffeting on, driving down the interstate where you feel a crosswind move. That's a crosswind versus dead on pushing you back. So there's a lot of, I spent 43 days studying aerodynamics, and I can't even tell you how many tests personally that I've done outdoors trying to learn things such as what's the fastest cycling helmet, what's the fastest skin suit, what's the fastest wheel. And I'm geeky enough that I would show up to the start of a time trial, and I would take a wind anemometer and would stand there at the start line and measure the speed of the wind and the yaw angle, and I would make a decision on what bicycle wheel I was going to use based on what I learned. Because I knew that I was never going to be the biggest, fastest, strongest cyclist, but maybe I can outthink some people. So I started playing around with that and learned a lot of things. One of the things that I learned is one of the most unaerodynamic shapes that exist is a cylinder. I'm going to use this paper towel tube as an example. And the reason is, as the air hits this cylinder, it wraps around and then it separates. And as it separates, behind this cylinder becomes a low pressure area. Now, air doesn't appreciate the difference between high pressure and low pressure around an object. So what it does is it wants to pull this object back away from where you're trying to move. Moving forward, it's saying, I don't like this at all. So this air completely separates. And so we're going to talk about how that applies to things in a little bit. One of the reasons that you worry about that is you're trying to go fast. So this is what is known as a trip sock. So you'll notice that there's fabric right here because we have a problem. Our body is full of cylinders, biceps, forearms, thighs, calves. They're all cylinders. And the question is, well, what can I do about that? Because I can't alter the shape of my body, but you can do something. And one of the things that you can do is trick the air. Now, actually, you're not tricking it, you're tripping it. And what that means is, as the air is going around the cylinder, if you have a piece of material like these black strips, the air will hit that and create turbulent airflow. And you think turbulence, that's a bad thing. If you're on an airplane and the pilot says we're approaching some areas with turbulence, you're thinking this is bad. But in this part of the situation, it's actually very important, because as the air is turbulent, it will stay attached to the cylinder longer, which means it reduces the amount of pressure behind this cylinder object like your calf. And if you look, you can see right here, if you look, hopefully you can see it, you can see how chaotic a cylinder is and how it creates this separation. And you want to think, how can I correct this to make the air stay attached longer? There's many ways that you can do that. One of them is by using tricks in clothing. Another example would be what we use in cycling called a skin suit. And if you look closely, you can see that there's different types of material in different areas where these cylinders are hitting air, and you're trying to trip the air so that there's less separation. The other thing that people have learned is there are some objects that very much rely on aerodynamics. One of them would be a golf ball. If you've ever played golf or know someone that plays golf, you would know that this is a Pro V1. You probably can't see it, but it's a Pro V1, which is one of the most sought after golf balls on the market because they put so much research and development into this golf ball. This golf ball has 388 dimples. Technically, they're not dimples though, they're turbulators. However, that's a challenge for the marketing department to say this has 388 turbulators. It's easy to say dimples. Now what this does is as the ball is flying through the air, it is doing the same thing as we talked about with the clothing. It is trying to get the air to stay attached longer as it goes through the air, hence going further. This ball is well renowned for going further, straighter, and behaves very well in different types of winds. This is a vice ball. This ball has 318 dimples. Now why difference? Well, this ball is designed to get more flight, more lift, to help a kind of a more amateur player get the ball up into the air versus a Pro V1, which a more advanced player is wanting more control. Now, why do they want more control? When you're around the greens and you're trying to hit a chip shot, you want to be able to create that spin. And if you've ever stumbled onto a golf broadcast, you've probably seen one of these pro players hit a ball and it lands on the green and it comes backwards. And you think, how in the world did they do that? One of them is dimples. It's creating enough backspin that when it lands, it's coming backwards so fast that it'll roll backwards, and it's more control versus a ball like this that is more about helping an amateur golfer get it up in the air and be more forgiving. So you see that a lot in sports. One of the things I wanted to show you was the clothing. If you look at this photo, this is a photo of my wife at the start of a time trial, and you can see the socks that she's wearing and the skin suits and the helmet that she's wearing. I believe you won that time trial, if I'm not mistaken.
I did.
Another example would be this picture of a state time trial that my teammates and I were in, and you can see all the optimized wind tested positions that we did with clothing, helmets, wheels, etc. Now the wheels are interesting. Lots of visual aids, sorry. This is an example of a NACA-shaped wheel. This was developed in the 1990s by Steve Head with the partnership with DuPont. You can't really see it, but these are airfoils. One is fatter in the front and thinner in the back, so as it rotates through the air, it makes a very aerodynamic shape. It's one of those wheels that has remained very popular because it's always fast. This is known as a disc wheel. This wheel is designed to go in the back of the bicycle so that you have almost a sail. It allows you to harness the wind, and it's very, very fast. So these objects are very efficient for sport. Golf manufacturers have even started looking at golf clubs. They looked at aerodynamics and thought, well, if we can harness aerodynamics for a golf ball, why can't we do it with a club? And so they started putting grooves in these drivers and clubs to increase the player's swing speed. Maybe not a lot, maybe 2 watts. But there's a famous saying by David Brailsford, who was the team director of Sky Sports. They won a lot of bike races. And he said, always seek the 1%. Marginal gains. You find a little gain here, a little gain there, a little there, a little there, and you don't leave it on the table. And it all adds up. So he had this mantra of always find the little things. Now, you also have aerodynamics in cars. So if you look, you can see behind that car, there is a turbulent area where the air is separating. So as that air separates, it's creating that drag. So car manufacturers really try to figure out, how do we make this more efficient? If you've ever seen one of these cars with the, looks like little shark fins on the roof towards the back, you may think, what in the world is that? Well, an example is the old car antennas. They were just cylinders. And as we learned earlier, cylinders, not good. They're very unaerodynamic. Now you see car antennas on roofs. They look like a shark fin. Now if you look, have you ever seen one of those cars with all those little tiny shark fins right above the rear window? What it's trying to do is force the air towards an area to where this low pressure area is reduced. And what does that do? It increases miles per gallon. I would venture to guess that most people have a general idea of what miles per gallon their car gets. And car manufacturers know that that's an important selling feature. And so they're starting to come out with more aerodynamic features of how do we make this car more efficient and use less fuel. For many reasons, marketing and also the EPA is really wanting car manufacturers to, every couple of years, increase fuel economy. So they're looking at, well, what else can we do? Because engines can only take us so far in efficiency, but we can manage air. So managing the air allows us to increase fuel economy just by looking at shapes. So the next time you see a Corvette or a Maserati or a very fast car, you can look at it and think, yes, it looks neat, but there's thinking behind that. They've done a lot of research into that. And if you're a fan of F1 or NASCAR, they put millions of dollars, even just trying to figure out what's the fastest spoiler that we can do for this car. Or a NASCAR team may say, well, we're going to be drafting for X amount of time at Daytona, and the humidity is going to be probably this, so let's adjust different parts of the car to see if we can get a marginal gain. And it doesn't take much in something like an F1 or even a NASCAR race to just get that one moment where you can pass them in one race, and it could be worth millions of dollars in sponsorship money. So everybody's looking for these tiny gains. So to reinforce what Sir David Brailsford, yes, he was knighted in 2003. Always be looking for the 1% marginal gains. So that's why aerodynamics is important in our daily lives, in sport, and just anything you see on TV. Next time you get on a plane, you can look at the wing and you can think of it differently. So you can see the world a little bit differently as you move around with like, why is it that way? Why do you think they made it that way? There's probably a reason. A lot of it has to do with aerodynamics. So I want to thank you for your time, and I appreciate it. And I hope you learned something. Thank you.